Duke Watson. Before we leave the Mount Rainier training experience, is there anything else you'd like to add?
The only addition I can make is the profound feeling I had when I got my order to go ahead for Fort Benning for officer candidate training. It was with a tremendous mixture of feeling. Although I'd been assured by both my company commander, Paul Lafferty, and by our regimental commander, Colonel Rolfe, that I would be coming back to the division. It wasn't even a division at that time, but be coming back to the expanded battalion. I left with some element of doubt, and it was a very tough decision, because here this was the best Army duty that most of us could have imagined, and I hated to be leaving it, especially at Mount Rainier. So I went with a very profound feeling of wonder if I'd ever get back to it, and that was quite a story in itself, but it did work out.
Tell me about how you got back to it.
Well, our training, the standard school training for most units at Fort Benning, and I think this is true in all the other areas where individual branches of the service were being trained, seemed to be a 13-week course, no matter what the course was. I went later on to an advanced officer training course at Benning. That was for 13 weeks. But at the end of the 13 weeks, as that time grew near, there was a rumor circulating in our group, those of us who were about to graduate with our new lieutenant's bars, that there was a certain sergeant down at post headquarters that could tell you what your unit you were being assigned to was. And here these classes were roughly 200 men at a crack, and they weren't assigning 200 men all together to one unit. Maybe most of them were, but it varied from time to time. In our case, I was a member of Class 20, where had I gone down for earlier, a few months earlier, I would have been in Class 4. But anyway, I went down to post headquarters and looked up this sergeant, and he checked me out and said, "You're assigned to the 95th Division at," ironically, Camp Swift, Texas. I say ironically because that's where the 10th ended up a couple of years later. But I wanted no part of the 95th Division. That would have been a new reserve division, and I knew something had gone askew. So in somewhat, this was in the afternoon after we'd finished our afternoon field work or classes or whatever it was, but it was still lunchtime at Fort Lewis, and but I put in a call for our commanding officer, Colonel Rolfe, at Fort Lewis. This was on a payphone outside of post headquarters at Fort Benning, wondering if I'd ever reach him. Lo and behold, the operator put me through, and after distributing the required number of quarters or something, I'm sure Colonel Rolfe wondered what on earth was going on. Here his voice came on, and I said, "Sir, this is Private Watson about to be, or Candidate Watson. I was sent down here from Mount Rainier, Captain Lafferty's company. Oh, Watson, I remember you, of course. How's it going down there?" And so on. I said, "Well, sir, we're about to get out, but I've just learned that I'm being assigned to the 95th Division at Camp Swift, Texas." And he said, "Well, those things happen in the service. Something's gone wrong, but don't worry, we can take care of it." He said, "It may take a little time, but we're not going to forget you." But he said, "By the way," this is sort of a quick afterthought he had. He said, would you mind, would you be willing to take a side trip up to Washington, D.C. when you get your commission? And I said, yes, sir. And he said, well, you remember Colonel Cochran? And Colonel Cochran had been the executive officer of the regiment serving under Colonel Rolfe. And I said, yes, sir, I do remember Colonel Cochran. He said, well, he's on duty at Army Ground Forces. He said, I'm going to send him a wire, and you report to him, and I think he can probably take care of things immediately and maybe get your orders changed. So lo and behold, that's what happened. I went up to Washington, and there was a big group of our class, our graduating class, that were headed up to the mid-Atlantic or Northeast for a little stay at home before their assignment, wherever it might be. But this was on a Friday evening, and it turned out the Army Ground Forces area was still not functioning on Saturday. It was everything was closed down on Saturday, so I had to spend the weekend in Washington. But on Monday morning, bright and early, I reported out to the Army Ground Forces, which is a big establishment, and I can't remember quite where it was in the General Washington geographic layout, but as I went down into the main building, down this long corridor, there was a tall figure advancing toward me, and I knew immediately from a distance who it was. It was General Mark Clark. There was nobody in the Army quite as tall. He was about 6'6", and I'd seen quite a few pictures of him. He had just completed a very daring mission of landing in North Africa under great secrecy, and it had something to do with bringing in funds in bags of gold to support the British and American units that were there. And it was a successful unit, so he had been given quite a bit of publicity, and his picture had been in all the papers all over the country. So I correctly spotted General Clark, and as I approached him, I kind of froze in my tracks and saluted, and he put me at rest and said, are you just up from Benning? And I wondered how he knew, but there were not any second lieutenants with brand new bars running around there. So I said, yes, sir, and he chatted with me for about 5 minutes, wondering how the training had gone and so on, in a very pleasant manner, and didn't ask me what I was up to in Army Ground Forces, but told me to proceed. So I found Colonel Cochran's office, and the whole procedure took about 15 minutes. He remembered me also because I'd been the first person sent down from the unit, so it was, that had attracted a bit of attention. And Cochran said, well, now, I think we can arrange this right on the spot. He said, I'm going to take you over to Brigadier General so-and-so in the next room here, who will process this. So he took me over and introduced me to the general, who was a very jovial, accommodating person. And within a couple of minutes, the general got on the phone with the replacement training command in Birmingham, Alabama, and got hold of some other general, I guess, that he called Bill, and he said, Bill, I've got a young lieutenant here just out of Benning, and we want to change his orders. And I want him to report to the 87th Mountain Infantry at Fort Lewis, Washington. So he gave Bill the background and the assignment I had received. Within 5 minutes, it had all been taken care of, and the general, whose name I don't recall and I should remember with reverence, said, we'll will 2 weeks delay en route be enough? And I said, yes, sir. I should have said, well, 3 weeks would be better, but I was so happy to be headed back to Fort Lewis. So there I was with 2 weeks to stop off at home, my home being in Illinois, which I did, and then headed on west. And that was my return to the mountain troops. And I reported in as the first lieutenant that had come from the ranks.
Wow, that was pretty exciting.
Well, it certainly was. I was welcomed by my now fellow officers. They were all taking they were being very accommodating and welcoming me into the fold. But that really triggered a procession. Once I got back there, a lot of my buddies who had been qualified, who had college background or whatever, but had no thought of applying for officer candidate school, it started a rush, and there were all kinds that signed up for it, and most of them achieved it, still had time to get their training in and get back, and there was a large group that kind of went all at once and reported back to the brand new 86th, which was being created at at Camp Hale.
Can you tell me more about what the mission was of the Columbia Icefields expedition?
Do you know anything about it? Yes, all right.
But I mean, can you tell me what you know?
I'll try to be brief. When we went up there, you won't believe I'm being brief, but I will try to consolidate. When we went up there,
where did you go?
well, to begin with, I was called in by Colonel Cook, who was our regimental executive officer, and he said, "Watson, you and Lieutenant Hurst are being picked." Hurst had been another new returnee from candidate school. And he said, "We're going to send you up there with 60 enlisted men, up there being a special assignment up in Alberta. It'll be out of Banff Springs." And he said, "It's going to be up in what's called the Columbia Icefield." Well, I knew where the Columbia Icefield was, and I couldn't believe this fortuitous assignment. But anyway, I was told, along with Lieutenant Hurst, to select 60 enlisted men. We were supposed to spend the next 3 days visiting at all hours here and there units in the whole 87th and picking who we thought would be qualified. We were given this assignment and it was left up to our judgment. And so we got, of course, the word buzzed around, and the men who wanted to be part of that assignment were, well, 90% of the command probably, and it made our selection a bit on the difficult side, and I'm sure there were some disappointed personnel, but in any event, we got our 60 selected, and then all our logistics were arranged. We were dispatched down to the port at Seattle and got on a ferry for Vancouver, BC, and disembarked from the ferry and were conducted to the railway station and boarded the Canadian Pacific train for Banff, Alberta.
What was the purpose of the expedition?
Well, we didn't know yet, but and Colonel Cook had not divulged anything. He said this is a top secret assignment, so I can't tell you much about it. After our pleasant train experience, we were met at not at Banff, but at Lake Louise is where we disembarked. And here were a whole fleet of Army 6x6 trucks ready for us to load up in. And we were greeted by a first lieutenant who was slightly senior, who I had gotten to know pretty well, Lieutenant Paul Townsend, who is now deceased, but Townsend was sort of in charge for the moment of the activity. And he conducted our group. We must have had about 4 or 5 trucks, because it was not only the 60 men, but all our gear and so on. We didn't know how long we were going to be there. And we were driven, let's see, it was I couldn't tell you exactly, it was to the 117-mile post where we turned off on a rough branch road. Now, at that time, the road we were headed north on was what eventually became the renowned Banff-Jasper Highway, which is one of the prime scenic highways of the continent now. But the road wasn't even punched through then. It dead-ended just shortly beyond where we turned off.
So you're turning off onto a non-road?
We turned off onto what had been created, just a little truck trail. And we went for about 3 miles in these Army rigs. Of course, you don't see many of them anymore, but they're canvas topped over an arch, so their visibility for those who are riding, other than up with the driver, is nil, except for looking out from where you came. But anyway, we finally got deposited, and here were a row of tents that had been set up. There were personnel that had been, I think, contracted to do this. And we moved into those. This was after dark we arrived there. But next morning, action started right away. Again, we were left in, nobody seemed to know what this was all about, other than that we were going to, our assignment was going to be to set up a base camp, which was somewhat already established. And we were going to have to somehow build a road up the Saskatchewan Glacier, which was 9 miles long, draining one of a radius of glaciers that was appended to the Columbia ice field. And we were going to have to get a road up this glacier and establish a camp high up on a bench on the upper part of the glacier. It was quite a challenge, but the Army felt, or the command that had investigated it, felt it would be doable. Well, it turned out that I was given the assignment of being in charge of the advance camp, where Lieutenant Hurst stayed down at the base camp. And so I had about probably, well, I think our command was split equally. I had about 30 of the men with me. And but we were all down at base camp until we got that road built. And the most difficult part of it was trying to build and approach a ramp up the snout of the glacier. The glacier came down into the valley. It might have receded considerably since those days, but it had an abrupt end, which was not very high. It was probably 11 or 12 feet high, but rather an abrupt wall. And we somehow had to cut a ramp up that a Army 6x6 truck or a Jeep could climb up. Once you got up the ramp that we were going to construct, it was going to be relatively easy, because there was what is called a medial moraine, which came down the center of the glacier, caused by rock converging from a point where 2 ice streams converged together, and rock gradually spilling from that apex of the mountain wall, and building a little gravel line of stability on top of the ice, and it would serve as kind of a natural roadbed. These big, heavy 6x6 trucks could just pounded their own roadway by pounding some of the boulders, the smaller ones. Of course,
What was the purpose of building this road?
The purpose of building the road was to get us up to this bench 9 miles up where we were to build this camp. Now, at that point, it was divulged that we're going to build a camp consisting of Quonset huts, metal huts, which were going to be trucked up to us. And we were to work feverishly against a deadline because we were building this for the Studebaker Corporation, which had been one of the car manufacturers in pre-war days and extended in through the 50s. People still remember some of the Studebakers, but the Studebaker Corporation had been given the assignment of developing a snow vehicle with certain characteristics. Nobody knew anything about what this vehicle was going to be used for, other than that the Army was going to have some use for it. So obviously it meant something to do with combat in the north or in the mountains. And so it was an exciting assignment. And after about a week, we got this ramp built. It was quite difficult. We were trying to use TNT, but the ice didn't offer any resistance, so it would just poof instead of exploding like it would have done in rock. So we ended up having to, with pick and shovel, build a ramp. And then it was short work getting the trucks with our own gear up where we had to camp out with some actual just Army shoulder half tents. But along with us came a truckload of components for these Quonset huts. So we began to set those up. We had 9 Quonset huts we built in a row. And after the first one, all the details of erection were processed. The rest went quite smoothly. And presently we had a nice looking camp. And as soon as we had it completed, the Studebaker Corporation arrived. Their vice president in charge of engineering came out, their headmaster mechanic and a whole corps of mechanics under him. And they were ready to go to work using the Columbia ice field as a proving ground. Now we were up there from mid-August until just before Christmas, and the intent had been to stay through the winter, but it was decided that on the basis of 2 facts. First, that it would be much too difficult to try to service us, even the road going north from Lake Louise through midwinter would have been a tough haul, keeping that road open for us. And secondly, the Studebaker Corporation, by early winter, by early December, decided they were far enough along they could complete the vehicle as they wanted it back in South Bend, Indiana. But in the meantime, we had a regular proving ground up on the Columbia ice field. Am I getting too detailed here?
No, go ahead.
And before we could get up there, though, here we were 9 miles up the Saskatchewan Glacier, and that's where the head of the glacier as a long tongue originated. But from there, it was coming off of the ice field, which was still several hundred feet vertical above this bench where our camp was. And at that point, there was no medial moraine. We had to go up through the ice, and it was just like climbing a glacier on Mount Rainier, beset with crevasses. And this was a magic number because it matched our regimental number. We had 87 bridges we built across these crevasses. And the boys down below were busy cutting, they had permission from the Canadian Park Service to cut down lodgepole pines into short lengths and ship them up to us to span these crevasses. And we've developed 87 of those bridges up a route that would accommodate these vehicles, which were still in a rudimentary form but could travel. The rudiments had been constructed back in Indiana, the headquarters of the Studebaker Corp. And we could also, they had to be supportive and wide enough to allow a Jeep to travel up too, a Jeep with chains. And ultimately, we actually got one of these big 6x6 trucks up onto the ice field. And as a matter of fact, late in our project up there, three of us drove one of those trucks up to the summit of the snow dome, which is the hydrographic apex of North America, the only point on the continent that flows to three different oceans, the Atlantic, the Arctic, and the Pacific. And
It sounds like it might have been a little dangerous with all these crevasses. Was it
Well,
dangerous to do this on the snowfield?
Well, we had remarkably good luck, except for one awful accident, which I'll describe in just a moment. But once we got the bridges built, then it was time to bring the Studebaker people in. So they came in without delay and set to work immediately. One of the Quonset huts was set up as a shop, and they would work in that night and day. And then they had mechanics and crew taking these machines. They had a number of them. I've forgotten how many, at least a half dozen, maybe more, and up over the 87 bridges and up onto the ice field itself, which is an enormous plateau of ice, of just gently rolling terrain, just ideal for a testing ground. And actually, the Office of Strategic Services, which is the predecessor of the CIA, this OSS was under Dr. Vannevar Bush, and his right-hand man was a chap named P.C. Putnam, who was acting as a civilian with the OSS, but he spent a lot of time with us, and he wouldn't divulge what it was all about. He professed not to really know himself, but he did allude to the fact that this was had to do with a highly strategic mission that had been conceived out of headquarters in London, and in connection with United Kingdom intelligence. So all we could still surmise was that it was going to be used somewhere in the mountains or up in northern snowfields. In any event, the Studebaker crews would take these machines up, work all day. We had, of course, daylight was long when we first got there, and then they'd bring the machines down, and they were taking pictures of them in action, of the what they called the grouser wheels that the tracks traveled around, all sorts of the details of the mechanical function. And they'd then part of the crew would spend most of the night studying film and looking for correction possibilities and so on. It was very detailed mechanical work, but these films had to be processed. So one of our missions was every evening at 5 o'clock, a Jeep would report up there at our base, and the movies that had been taken that day would be loaded with a Jeep driver, and he'd get down as fast as he could to the main highway, and there a Studebaker sedan that was really souped up would be waiting. The film would be transferred to that, and this guy would take off for Calgary, which was quite a few hours away. And he'd get to Calgary, it would be an all-night drive, and he'd get there early in the morning, and he'd, I think about 8 a.m., possibly a little later, an eastbound flight would arrive, and they'd load the film on the eastbound Canadian Pacific Airways flight, and that film would eventually go to Rochester, New York, to the Kodak headquarters, and the driver would have to wait until about noontime when a westbound plane would bring the film from 2 days previous, which Eastman had now processed. Then he'd charge all the way back up and would reverse the process. And that went on every day, 7 days a week. So this was an enchanting project, and we all wondered, where on earth is it going to end up? But nobody knew and never did know until almost the end of the war in Italy, when the news came out, and it was all after the fact. And this machine had been designed to be able to accommodate, I think it was 3 men and 500 pounds of TNT, be light enough to be parachuted, but stable enough to carry this load and be able to travel over snow. And the idea was for a surprise drop by parachute near the German heavy water plants in Norway. But of course, it had to be top secret, because if the idea had leaked out, it would never have been achieved. And all this time, while we were involved on the ice field, there was a special group of a joint Canadian-American team that was a really high-powered outfit that were going through very rigorous training over somewhere in Montana. I've forgotten exactly where, and they were to be the team. It was a fairly large group because they were going to need support, but they were going to be the personnel that operated these vehicles in the parachute drop. So it was an astonishing project, and it all went for naught because before it could be achieved, the Norwegian government in exile had convinced none other than Winston Churchill that they felt that Norwegian guerrillas could handle it more quickly and probably with more certainty than this parachute dropping, which sounded dramatic but pretty iffy. So it never came to pass. With, and in a way, it's too bad it didn't come to fruition, but at least the mission was accomplished by the Norwegian guerrillas. But it was a pretty exciting thing. It was such a mystery, and we knew there was something big going on, especially when the OSS was so involved with us. And I nearly got detached and became a part of the OSS. This guy Putnam talked to me seriously about it, and he said, I think there'd be great opportunities for you. Well, I didn't speak any foreign language, and I said, Mr. Putnam, I think I want to stay with the 10th. But
what were the hazards of working up on that ice field?
do you want to go back on? We did have one very nasty accident, fortunately only one, and it was because of the bridges on the crevasses. It wasn't the fault of a bridge, but it was the fault of a crevasse. And 2 of our men, 2 stalwarts, had been up there with part of the Studebaker crew, and they were coming down in midday for some sort of refurbishment of supplies, but a fog had rolled in. It was extremely fog. The visibility was very poor, and they'd been up and down over these bridges so much they knew some shortcuts where they didn't have to take every bridge, and they intentionally but foolhardily took a shortcut, and all of a sudden a big yawning crevasse loomed up in front of them, and the driver a Corporal Rinky. I well remember his name. His impulse, as he saw the crevasse ahead, was to swerve the machine, which he did. This was this was one of the Studebaker machines, and I'm a little off here because it had to be. There was no such thing as a skidoo then, but it seemed to me that this was smaller. I think that Studebaker had built some smaller machines that had no cab or anything of that sort. It was more of a toboggan, and but track driven. And so the driver, there were just two of them, and the driver cut the machine, swerved it. And so unfortunately, the momentum carried them broadside into the crevasse. They hit the far wall, didn't quite make it over, and crashed. And this was a big crevasse, but fortunately there was a kind of a big bench that choked a good share of the crevasse down about 15 feet, and they lit down there. And the rider, a chap named Eldon Metzger, was totally undamaged. He didn't have a bone broken, or he was just sort of shaken up. The driver, both legs were just shattered, and he was in terrible pain. And Metzger, fortunately, was had come into the service as a very proficient climber. He'd done a fair amount of ice work, so he had no tools to work with, no ice axe or anything of that sort, but he was able to toe kick and claw his way up this ice wall, and he got almost the top and peeled off and dropped down. He gathered himself, took a short rest, and tried again, and it was a sort of superhuman effort. He felt there was no telling when they'd ever would have been found with all the numerous crevasses, and no matter how much they shouted, their voices wouldn't carry loudly from down in the crevasse. So he knew he had to get out of there, and he made it. He got to the lip and made his way on down. And fortunately, as he reported in, he was very haggard and reported to me, and by good luck, one of the supporting staff was a doctor, Captain Gib Reynolds, who happened to be up there. It was one of his infrequent visits, just coming up to see how the health of everyone was. So he immediately, along with several of us, handpicked, got into one of the larger Studebaker vehicles, went up to the scene, Metzger leading us to it, and with a stretcher, and a team went down to the bench, was lowered down, and Rinky was carefully loaded onto the stretcher and carefully hauled up. It was quite an operation, but it worked. And then he had to be gently put on this toboggan. No, he was loaded somehow onto the Studebaker vehicle, taken down to our base camp, and then put in a Jeep, and ultimately a Studebaker sedan, and hauled to the nearest hospital, which was at Canmore, BC. Canmore's a little town just a few miles east of Banff. And this was, of course, in what are we talking about? This is late in, this would have been in about August or September of 1942. And when I came back to the States in mid-45, with my recovering from my own wounds, and was assigned to Madigan General Hospital at Fort Lewis. Lo and behold, there was Corporal Rinke just getting a discharge, but he had spent almost the entire time in this little hospital at Canmore, where this wonderful director of the hospital, it was a very small hospital, and a doctor there just devoted himself to Rinke's compound fractures of both legs from the hips right on down, and he rebuilt Rinke's legs, and Rinke was able to walk. It was a wonderful story. But that had been his Army career.
Oh my gosh. Let me change tapes real quick.